Melania Trump, an icon of diplomacy, meets Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a rising African leader, in a televised debate. Traoré's opening statements are so bold and calculated that they force Melania to rethink her strategy. What could possibly make a seasoned diplomat hesitate? Discover how this exchange flips expectations. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video. The story began with a plain envelope hand-delivered to Trump Tower, addressed not to former President Trump, but to Melania herself. Inside was an invitation written in direct, almost forceful language. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional leader of Burkina Faso, had requested a public debate, airing his desire to discuss matters of international diplomacy, sovereignty, and global relationships with her specifically. The phrasing wasn't meant to intimidate, but it carried a tone that suggested he wasn't shy about making his position heard. When Marcus Wellington, her longtime advisor, handed over the letter, Melania reportedly raised her eyebrows. While Burkina Faso wasn't a country that typically carried the weight of global attention, Traoré's growing reputation for defiance against the Western status quo piqued her curiosity. Wellington explained why this opportunity could matter. Captain Traoré has been stirring conversation across Africa and beyond, he said, referencing the young leader's push for self-reliance and his criticism of foreign meddling in African nations. Wellington took pains to frame Traoré as ambitious, yet inexperienced in the complexities of global diplomacy. To him, the debate wasn't just an opportunity to provide clarity. It was a stage for Melania to demonstrate why experience and tact still triumphed over boldness. Still, skepticism lingered. To accept the challenge of a debate against a leader, many in her circle believed lacked formal training in international politics was a risk, even if it didn't appear so on the surface. During discussions, Melania speculated about Traoré's motivations. Was this a bid for legitimacy on a global platform? A chance to bolster his nation's image while subtly challenging Western influence? Whatever it was, Melania thought the conversation would likely descend into ideas that were more symbolic than logistical. Her confidence came not just from her years navigating diplomatic circles, but from the belief that her composed demeanor and understanding of bureaucratic nuance would overshadow Traoré's populist, firebrand rhetoric. But the more her team probed into Traoré's background, the more intriguing he became. Traoré wasn't just inviting debates for the sake of appearances. He'd openly challenged the structures of international aid, accusing certain programs of fostering dependency instead of empowering local economies. Furthermore, he'd drawn clear lines against reliance on Western nations, favoring an Africa-first strategy that included partnerships built on equality rather than presumed patronage. He was also young, far younger than most of his peers on the international stage, which gave his approach a sharpness and clarity that both excited and unnerved his supporters and detractors alike. Wellington continued urging Melania to see this as a win. "You have every advantage," he reassured her. "He's untested, and you've lived through some of the most high-profile global diplomatic events in history." While his words held truth, there was a part of her that remained unsettled. Wellington had painted Traoré as unprepared, but the reports suggested otherwise. Newspaper excerpts from regions across West Africa described him as deeply calculated, a leader who spoke straightforwardly, but always seemed to have an end game in mind. Publicly, he carried himself humbly, but his track record for challenging larger powers put him in a category separate from the average transitional leader. In the end, her curiosity outweighed her reservations. The opportunity to engage in such a unique public exchange was too enticing to ignore. She agreed to the debate, confident she'd be the one making an example, not the other way around. What she hadn't anticipated, however, was how well Traoré's vision for African self-determination could connect to people watching far beyond his borders. As the preparations began for the live debate, anticipation grew. The media framed the matchup as a symbolic battle, an emblem of Western diplomacy versus a voice of rising African power. Even with her calm facade, Melania couldn't completely ignore the weight of what lay ahead. What she assumed would follow classic diplomatic patterns would soon take a far more unexpected shape. And it all began the moment Traoré stepped onto that stage. The debate was broadcast live from 2 locations, each chosen for strategic symbolism. In Washington, D.C., Melania Trump sat in a sleek, modern studio, surrounded by polished decor, a setting that radiated formality and diplomatic prestige. Thousands of miles away in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared in a simple, understated studio. He wore practical attire, avoiding anything that might overshadow his message. This stark contrast signaled to viewers from the outset that this would not be a typical political exchange. While Melania carried the composed demeanor one would expect from a seasoned public figure, Traoré's relaxed confidence conveyed an authenticity that immediately drew attention. As the cameras turned to Traoré for the opening statement, his first words disrupted the room's usual diplomatic rhythm. "It's time to show the world that Africa doesn't need tutors. It needs partners who respect us as equals," he began, his tone calm but firm. Unlike the soft introductions of shared values and diplomacy that usually launch such discussions, Traoré's words signaled an intentional and unapologetic focus on sovereignty and equality. It was a declaration, not a mere opening gesture, and it shifted the mood instantly. Melania's expression barely changed, but the slight narrowing of her eyes hinted at the unexpected weight of his statement. He built on this momentum by addressing global power imbalances with directness. His focus was clear. The structures that had defined international politics, aid and trade, needed rethinking. Traoré drew from real-world examples to ground his arguments, referencing Burkina Faso's decision to move away from reliance on the Franco CFA currency. This act, controversial in some circles, exemplified his commitment to self-reliance and economic independence. He framed this as not only a national decision, but part of a broader African movement toward rejecting outdated systems rooted in foreign control. The strategy was intentional. These weren't abstract philosophical points, but tangible actions that made his words carry weight. "We've seen how dependency erodes dignity," Traoré continued, speaking directly to a global audience. "The aid model tells us we are incapable, but our history defies that conclusion." He drew connections between Africa's current trajectory and other nations' paths toward autonomy, including America's struggle for independence. Linking the two, he suggested that Africa's journey toward equal partnerships was neither new nor revolutionary. It was simply a continuation of what had worked for others in history. Viewing the debate as more than a clash of perspectives, he positioned his argument in a much larger historical narrative. Faced with this, Melania maintained her calm appearance, yet subtle tells hinted at cracks in her initial confidence. Her posture shifted slightly, and while she nodded at times, there was a hint of calculation behind her composed exterior. It was clear she had anticipated broad appeals to national pride or critiques of external powers, but Traoré's specific examples of economic reforms and his critique of international aid made the conversation more grounded than she had expected. This wasn't just rhetoric, it was a challenge based on actions. What made Traoré's words even more striking was the way they resonated beyond their immediate context. His emphasis on mutual respect and partnership wasn't solely aimed at defending Burkina Faso's policies. It resonated with an audience far beyond his nation's borders, particularly in countries questioning the legacy of post-colonial power dynamics. The clarity and directness of his arguments made it difficult to dismiss his points as the idealism of an untested leader. As he finished his statement, the room seemed heavier than before. Melania prepared her response, visibly aware that she'd underestimated the scope and specificity of his opening remarks. The moment required a pivot. Whatever assumptions she might have had about leading the discussion were quickly slipping away. Traoré had set the tone, and it was clear he wouldn't allow her to steer the debate without responding directly to the issues at hand. Melania began her response with the calm poise of someone who had rehearsed each word and layered every sentence with calculated intent. She cited her experience as First Lady, highlighting moments she had been at the forefront of international discussions, from global women's rights initiatives to handling major diplomatic engagements alongside some of the world's most powerful leaders. Her initial remarks were steeped in language promoting traditional alliances and multilateral cooperation, underscoring what she described as the value of stability in established diplomatic frameworks. Framing herself as a bridge builder, she spoke of partnerships that had advanced global issues, weaving in examples from her time advocating for trade policies and humanitarian programs. The argument appeared polished, but as her points unfolded, a noticeable disconnect emerged. While Melania emphasized strengthening existing partnerships and fostering global aid programs, Traoré's earlier remarks had already shifted the conversation to focus on sovereignty and systemic change. Her reassurance of the goodwill behind Western developmental aid sounded tone-deaf against Traoré's critique of dependency structures. When she subtly described Burkina Faso's reforms as important attempts at progress in a way that seemed geared to downplay their significance, the mismatch between her narrative and Traoré's own priorities became glaring. It wasn't an outright dismissal, but the tone suggested a gap in her understanding of what self-reliance actually entailed for nations like his. Traoré's counter was swift and pointed. He leaned on Burkina Faso's concrete achievements to dismantle her carefully constructed arguments. When Melania raised doubts about the efficacy of self-reliant development policies in under-resourced countries, He brought up figures that directly confronted her assumptions. In just 18 months, we created 45,000 jobs in the textile industry. These are not theories, these are results, he stated plainly. There was no need for embellishment. The data spoke louder than any rhetorical flourish. The impact of such tangible wins in Burkina Faso undercut the impression that his approach lacked pragmatism. While Melania emphasized caution and collaboration within traditional systems, Traoré's strategy of bold, self-driven action had already yielded undeniable outcomes. The debate took on an unintended tone as the strategies of the two speakers clashed. While Melania remained fixed on macro-level discussions about partnerships and economic structures, Traoré grounded his responses in Burkina Faso's lived realities. When she questioned the sustainability of his programs, he responded simply, "If 2.3 million people can eat this year instead of going hungry, does sustainability not begin there?" He didn't need to over-explain. His ability to tie policy to its immediate, personal impacts for his citizens subtly reframed Melania's contributions as academic exercises rather than action-oriented solutions. What stood out wasn't just how Traoré rebutted her critiques. It was the broader political sentiment his arguments reflected. His emphasis on national sovereignty and breaking free from colonial-era economic frameworks resonated beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, leaders and citizens had grown increasingly skeptical of traditional foreign interventions, and Traoré's confidence in confronting those power dynamics turned this debate into more than a discussion of policies. It became a challenge to the very assumptions underlying global diplomacy. His reminder that saying no when necessary and yes when it truly benefits your nation spoke directly to countries seeking respect on the global stage rather than validation or charity. As the discussion continued, there were signs that Melania was beginning to reassess her approach. While she initially treated Traoré as an ambitious regional leader, operating within narrowly defined limits, his responses repeatedly demonstrated a global perspective informed by both history and immediate challenges. Her body language, once composed and firm, became more guarded. As he spoke, she nodded slightly more, her counters coming slower, less assertive. There was no denying that Traoré's words were gaining traction with the audience, his arguments grounded in the kind of reality that couldn't be countered with diplomatic theory alone. Melania's confidence, built on her preparations and assumptions, started to look shaky. Her tone softened incrementally, as though reorienting to meet Traoré on his terms. The polished rhetoric remained, but her footing in the debate had shifted. The imbalance she had initially overlooked, the one between theoretical global ideals and actionable sovereignty, was becoming harder to ignore. What had started as a platform for her to showcase her grasp of diplomacy was turning into a far deeper examination of whose perspective carried more weight in the moment. The debate was no longer just about politics. It was about whose vision resonated louder. The debate between Melania Trump and Captain Ibrahim Traoré revealed more than a clash of ideas. It showcased the shifting power balance in global diplomacy. Melania's reliance on conventional approaches struggled to counter Traoré's vision rooted in sovereignty and tangible progress. He emphasized collaboration built on mutual respect, a sharp contrast to Western strategies framed around aid or control. As emerging leaders like Traoré challenge traditional frameworks, diplomatic norms face growing pressure to evolve. What does this mean for the future of global politics? How will old powers adapt as these new voices demand to reshape the rules of international engagement?